All right, so today, guys, we are going to be reviewing for our final exam essay, CCOT, talking about the Mediterranean world. So before we start talking about what could be our changing continuities, and hopefully you have out your completed CCOT chart, remember that that is going to be collected tomorrow, and I'm going to look at it when I get back from Utah, and it'll be collected tomorrow before you start writing your essay. So before we start actually talking about some of the changes and continuities that happened to the Mediterranean world from 200 to 1000, I want you to think about what areas first would be considered the Mediterranean region. Look at your chart. Hopefully you figured some of this out. I mentioned this in class last week. So I want you to think about that before we start talking, because we want to make sure that you're writing about the proper time, not only time period, but the proper region. Because I know that when this essay appeared on the AP exam, this concept, the Mediterranean region, threw a lot of kids off because they were like, well, we don't know where that is. Meanwhile, they did. They just couldn't wrap their brain around it. So take a couple seconds. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about what would be considered the Mediterranean region and write it down. All right, so I think that was roughly about 30 seconds. So, first thing you should be thinking about for the Mediterranean region would be the Roman Empire. So this map here shows the Roman Empire this says between 14 and 117 CE. So pretty much this is the extent of the Roman Empire in 117 CE, which would fit into the circa 200. So if you'll notice, the Roman Empire is pretty much ringing around the whole Mediterranean region. Also, you should have thought about, after the fall of Rome, you have then that this area is going to break up. You're going to see the Byzantine Empire, which is also going to be something that could be a focus of your essay. Also notice that we have all of these smaller kingdoms, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, basically all these barbarian groups that came in and had invaded Europe and led to the eventual fall of the Roman Empire. Also, you should be thinking about the spread of Islam, because Muhammad dies in 632, and then we start to see Islam beginning to spread throughout also the Mediterranean region as well. So you should be thinking about the Abbasids and the Umayyads. And then finally, this is the Mediterranean region around 1000. You'll notice the Byzantine Empire, is much smaller than it once was. And then you have these other, like the Abbasids, this whole big area here in green that has taken over as well. So you are focusing on, for this essay, Rome, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic Caliphates. That should be the things that you're thinking about for this essay. So those hopefully were the things that you looked up when you started considering your evidence for the essay. So now let's look at this essay question. It says, analyze how political transformation, so political, transformation means change, so how political changes contributed to the continuities and changes in the cultures of the Mediterranean region during the period 200 CE to 1000 CE. Now, a couple of things you want to keep in mind when looking at this question. Because the question specifically says political transformation, so you have to be talking about political change and how political change is contributing to changes and continuities in culture. So basically what you're going to be thinking about is what changes in cultures, what changes and continuities in culture, happened during this time period that was caused by political transformation. So the political transformation in itself is in some ways going to be the analysis. This is going to be the reason the change or continuity happened. So what you do not want to do in this essay is just write an essay giving me all of the changes and continuities in culture from this time period, or giving me an essay that only talks about changes in governments and political transformations during this time period. So it has to be, what are the changes in politics and how is that contributing to changes and continuities in cultures? So make sure you make that distinction. All right, so let's go through some of the pieces of evidence that you're going to need or you might want to consider using. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. I don't want you like frantically copying down everything I put up here. Also, if you just wrote everything that I have on these slides, this will not be enough evidence for you. You are going to have to be looking in your textbook and looking in your notes and expanding on these things. These are just things I came up with as guidelines for you so that you all make sure you're going in the right direction with this essay. So, some major examples of change. So at 200 CE, the Roman Empire is at its height. Remember, Christianity is banned, but despite that, it is still spreading, even though Christians are being persecuted. Think about all the achievements of ancient Rome and why Roman rule over this area would lead to these developments, like roads being built and aqueducts and temple building and architecture. All of it, primarily in 200 CE, is being linked to the fact that Rome has a relatively stable government. This is all going to begin to change pretty quickly. We're going to start to see instability within the empire as it begins to decline. Remember, the Roman Empire has a really long decline. So we see a loss of patriotism. We see political corruption. In the 290s, Diocletian decides to divide power within the empire, keeps it as one empire, but ruled by different emperors, because he feels that this is going to be a way to better control this empire, which is just way too large. Despite that, he's still doing things like persecuting the Christians. So the Christians are still being persecuted during this time period. I think I misspelled persecutes there. And churches are still being destroyed. That's going to change under Constantine. Constantine is going to reunite the empire, but he's going to move the capital to Constantinople. That political change is going to have a profound impact on the culture of Western Europe. Keep that in mind. He also makes Christianity the official religion. So that political change, where, mind you, before, everyone in Rome, the Romans were relatively religiously tolerant as long as you paid homage to the Roman emperor as a god. As long as you did that, you pretty much were okay. That ran into a problem with Christians and Jews, because Christians and Jews, being monotheistic, are not going to be willing to pay homage to the Roman emperor as a godlike figure. So Christians and Jews were persecuted. So this is going to be a pretty profound change once Constantine decides to make Christianity the official religion, and then eventually he himself converts to Christianity. This is going to be a major cultural change. This is going to mean that Christianity is now approved of by the Roman Empire. Christians in the Roman Empire no longer have to worship in secret. This also means that Christians within the Roman Empire can outwardly, more openly spread their religion. It's going to lead to a large spread in Christianity. So that would be a change I would hope that all of you would write about, because it's kind of important. Now, as far as the Byzantine Empire, before we even talk about the Byzantine Empire, I want to talk a little about the fall of Rome. So the fall of Rome, major political change, led to political decentralization in Europe with all these Germanic tribes that came in and invaded. This led to the development of feudalism. So I want you to think about when we talked about Europe during 600 to 1450. What impact did political decentralization, what impact did feudalism have on the culture of Europe, of Western Europe? Because you could still be talking about France, you could be talking about Italy, you could be talking about Spain. Those would all be parts of the Mediterranean world, and those would all be parts of Europe. So we see that Christianity becomes the dividing power. So with that end of political centralization, the Christian church, the Catholic Church, kind of rises up as the new kind of in some ways political unifier of the area. So we see a large push for the spread of Christianity. So this is when we see the Christianization of Europe, but we're also seeing a decline in literacy, decline of learning. Remember, everything becomes focused around religion, whereas the Romans were a little more secular, and they was focusing on learning and science and all these different things. Those things go away. the church becomes the major authority for everything. So you could talk about some of the changes in culture that happens as a result of that. So now let's go back up to the Byzantines. So remember, we should know this by now, that only the western portion of the Roman Empire falls in 476. The Eastern Roman Empire is known as the Byzantine Empire. These obviously are the dates of the total Byzantine Empire. You're not talking about them past 1000, because remember, you go past 1000, you're not, and it won't let me write the O. I'm trying to write another 0. There we go. If you write past 1000, you're not within the time period. So don't be talking about the fall of the Byzantine Empire. Don't write about, the conquest of the conquest of Constantinople, because that's in 1453 and beyond, well beyond the time period. So only the western portion of the Roman Empire falls. So you have to think about the Byzantine Empire. So again, this is a political change that leads to, you could say, a cultural continuity, because they continued the traditions of Rome. Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565, saw himself as Caesar. You could talk about how he built Hagia Sophia. You could talk about the preservation of Roman law. You could also talk about this concept of Caesaro-papism, the idea that he was considered the head of the church. You could approach this whole concept of Caesaro-papism in one of two ways. You could approach this as a continuity, because it's continuing the ideas of Rome as the Roman emperor being kind of like the head of the religion. You could also talk about it as a change, because you could talk about how this division is beginning to occur within the Orthodox Church and the Roman Church. And one of the reasons was that in Western Europe, you have all this political decentralization, which is why the church is able to rise up and gain power over the kings, whereas in the East, you still have this strong leader kind of controlling everything, and they don't want to give power to the church. You also could talk about the iconoclast controversy. Hopefully you remember that. If not, you should be looking it up in your textbooks or notebooks. So Leo III, who was a Byzantine emperor in 730, bans the use of all images in religious art. So that's a political change, leading to a cultural change, because now you're not allowed to make images, and so all the icons had to be destroyed, and it changed the way art was produced in the Byzantine Empire for about 100 years. So another major area you want to focus on is the rise of Islam and the caliphates. So you could talk about how the Umayyad dynasty and the Abbasid dynasty, these are both theocracies. Hopefully you remember theocracy means rule by religion, because since they are both Muslim empires, they would be ruled by the Sharia, which is Islamic law. So remember, also you could talk about the split between Sunni Islam and Shiite Islam, because the Umayyads were Sunni and the Abbasids were Shiite. So the Umayyad dynasty comes first. They helped to spread Islam, so a political change, the Umayyad dynasty taking over, beginning to conquer, leads to a cultural change, the spreading of Islam into North Africa and to Spain. They also spread Arab language and culture. And they did not give equality to the Mawali, which are the non-Arab Muslims. And if you remember anything about Islam, know that all Muslims are supposed to be considered equal before Allah. Remember, the Umayyad dynasty is going to fall because of basically corruption. The Abbasids thought that they were focusing too much on frivolous, materialistic things. So as a result, they were overthrown. They fled to Spain and continued to rule from there. You could also talk about that. The Abbasid dynasty goes from 758 to 1258. Those of you one of you was the Caliph of Baghdad when we did the Mongol trials. You remember that the Abbasid dynasty ends when the Mongols come in and invade and sack and destroy Baghdad in 1258. Again, you're not discussing that. You're only going up to 1000. Remember, they were Shiite Muslim. Power is going to shift from Damascus, which is in Syria today, to Baghdad. So that means that there's going to be more influence with Persian culture and language. So instead of an emphasis on Arabic and Arabic language culture, there's going to be more of an emphasis on Persian culture. Another change. They respected the Mawali, which are the non-Arab Muslims. They preserved Greek and Roman culture. So think about the library at Baghdad with all of these Greek and Roman ideas that were being translated. They also helped to spread Hindu culture. Think about things like the Indian number system. The other major area you might want to think about is Islamic Spain. So the Umayyad dynasty that ruled Spain during this time period would be the Ayyubidin dynasty, which lasted 756 to 1031. This also was a golden age for Spain. And this also was a period of ethnic tolerance between the Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Because remember, the dhimmis were the non-Arab, were the non-Muslims. They just had to pay the jizya, which was the head tax. So now, when it comes to you writing your thesis statement, a couple of things you must remember. The thesis accurately addresses and qualifies how political transformations contributed to change in the cultures of the Mediterranean region during the period 200 to 1000. So if all you talk about are political changes, it's not going to count as a thesis. If all you talk about is cultural changes, it's not going to count for your thesis statement. You must mention the region, the time period. You must cover the whole time period. You don't want to just be talking about Rome and not give me any evidence after the fall of Rome. You want to cover the full span of the time period. When writing your thesis, what was government's influence on like in culture in 200 and then in 1000? Remember, you don't have to list every change and every continuity in your thesis. But don't forget to mention your continuity in your thesis, otherwise you're not going to get the points. Remember, you have to have 6 pieces of evidence. You must address both change and continuity. Now, I want to give you a little bit of an example. So let's look at this thesis statement here. In 200 CE, the Mediterranean region was dominated politically by the Roman Empire. This created a single culture under Pax Romana, emphasizing education and devotion to the Roman Emperor and the persecution of such religions as Christianity and Judaism. However, by 1000 CE, the region is not dominated by one single power. Instead, the region is controlled by Islamic caliphates and the Byzantine Empire. As a result, Islam and Christianity has spread throughout the region. However, Greco-Roman learning and culture remained constant because of the Byzantine Empire and Abbasid Caliphate's desire to continue the ideas of the Roman Empire. Now, this is, let me be very clear with you, an example of a good thesis statement. You can use this as a guide, but if you write this thesis statement word for word back on your essay tomorrow, I am not going to give you full credit for a thesis statement. I want you to think of your own thesis statement. Now, other very important thing to keep in mind is you must have relevant world historical context effectively to explain change and continuity over time. You must have a global context paragraph. Remember, it is a full point on the rubric. It must be in its own paragraph before the conclusion, explaining how one political transformation's contribution to change or continuity in a culture of the Mediterranean impacted, and this is important, a region outside of the Mediterranean. So what's going on in the world that's affecting things outside of the Mediterranean? So I want you to keep all these things in mind as you prepare for your essay. I know you have about another 20 minutes left in class. What I want you to do is you can work with a partner, but you better not be loud or rude or anything to the sub, because if it gets too loud, whoever is covering the class is well within their rights to tell you have to work by yourself. And I want you to brainstorm and go over your changes and continuities. Make sure you feel like they're all valid. Make sure you have enough evidence. Make sure that you are connecting your changes in culture to a political transformation. Make sure you keep that very clear in your head. So work on this for the rest of the period. If you have any questions, if you need some help, you can email me and I'll email you back from Utah. Also, this video is going to be up on YouTube, so if you want to look over some of the other things, catch some of the things maybe you couldn't write down, you can do that tonight. Other than that, good luck tomorrow on your essay. Good luck on your multiple choice. Have a wonderful summer, and I will see you all next year.